Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, community members, staff, and friends of Joan Seymour. We're here this afternoon on a very sad occasion to honor Joan and her long service to the city of Southfield. I'm Mayor Kenson Cyber, and with us today, her colleagues, Donald Fracassi, Dan Brightwell, Myron Frazier, Lloyd Cruz, hope I haven't missed anybody. Oh, Lenny Taylor, our newest councilwoman, who's taken, will officially take Joan's place tonight at council. Nancy Banks, our clerk. And then a number of staff from the city administration and former council people, Suzanne Goldstein, Sylvia Jordan, and Barbara Tallies. Thank you, Barbara. And from the 46th District Court, I see Deborah Nance and Judge Arvant on the front row. At any rate, as many of you know, Joan was a rather private person. She didn't always share very much about herself, although in council discussions over the years, always things came out about Joan's life, and we knew that her service to the city centered around nature, the environment. Joan was a champion for woodlands, our tree ordinance, as well as our wetlands ordinance. We had a great controversy years ago, and this is really what propelled Joan into civic activism, was when the decision was made to put complete 696 through Southfield. And wetlands was removed and then recreated. It was quite for those of you that were here then, you remember this was quite an ordeal, and it went on for actually years before this was resolved. And Joan, living nearby, got very involved in this and ended up chairing a committee, and then started her service on city council. Joan also was very fond of animals and wildlife, and I can remember having many discussions with her about cats in particular. As you know, I fondly called her the cat woman. I'm not crazy about cats, so we had this thing back and forth, and she had a debate. We had a debate about cats wearing collars, and she felt they shouldn't wear collars. And we had the cat ordinance that really went whether cats should be on leashes, that they were outdoors. I mean, there were quite a few interesting discussions. I also know that Joan was very involved in the Audubon Society and liked birds, and so I used to tease her a little bit about, well, you know, Joan, cats, they go after birds, and she reminded me, well, Tweety always got away. At any rate, obviously, it was a good-natured banter back and forth. I much prefer dogs to cats, but Joan had cats for many, many years. So at this point, I would like to call on, I just see our Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence has arrived. So at this point, I'd like to call on Councilman Lloyd Cruz, who will to read the obituary.
It's always difficult to see a colleague, a family or friend member passed along, but she certainly left a legacy behind for all of us. So, Councilwoman Joan Seymour, Southfield City Councilwoman Seymour devoted her life to everything, including her constituents, working to protect the environment and pursuing her love of the arts. She died in her home on August 29th, 2017. She was 83 years old. Councilwoman Seymour served in Southfield City Council for 24 years, first elected in 1993. She served as the chair of the Council Finance Committee 4 times, chair of the Legislative and Urban Affairs Committee, and twice chaired the Boards and Commissions Committee. She was also a member of the Southfield Housing Authority and was elected council president 2 times and council president pro tem 5 times during her tenure. With a background that included over 30 years of corporate management, Councilwoman Seymour devoted significant time and energy to various causes that benefited the youth, women's issues, the environment, and the arts. Her volunteer activities began when she was a teenager, and Councilwoman Seymour continued to be active in a number of organizations, including serving as a board member of the Environmental Protection Council of Oakland County, the Detroit Audubon Societies, the National Wildlife Federation, board member of the International Arts Center and Institute, Michigan Wetlands Coalition, the National Organization of Women as co-chair of the Detroit Area Employment Committee, and as vice president of Working Opportunities for Women. Long interested in environmental issues, Councilwoman Seymour was active in preservation efforts to serve natural areas in the city of Southfield, and as a private citizen, led the successful effort to preserve a large wooded wetland in the path of the I-696 Expressway. Following this successful campaign, she helped to form the Southfield Wetland Woodlands Preservation Council. As its president, led the community-wide successful effort to enact both Wetlands Protection Ordinance and the Woodlands Protection Ordinance. She was active in gaining protection for several of Southfield's special natural areas, including Lincoln Woods Nature Preserve, Horsetail Woods Nature Preserve, and Carpenter Lake Nature Preserve, just among others. That was just a snippet of many of the things that she has done, and again, we appreciate her service, and may she rest in peace.
At this time, I'm going to call up Donald Fracassi, who will read the eulogy.
Thank you, Kenneth. I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. I know it's kind of tough because of the timing, and also it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A lot of people are working and couldn't get here. But I do want to welcome you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this ceremony, as I call it. You can call it a service. But it's just a great thing to be here. Joan, serving 24 years as a councilwoman, and that is really unusual for a person to serve that long a period of time. Southfield was only 35 years old, so you think that most of the time that she was a councilwoman, that she was a primary mover of how the city grew and how we developed through the years. As a former mayor and considered as one of her colleagues for years, we had a lot of times together when she'd come up to my office and we would have an ordinance or zoning, and we'd come up, and of course the mayor at the time had a veto power. So when she see there was going to be a tight vote, she'd come and talk to me and see whether or not I was going to veto it, or what could she do to convince me to to forget about the veto and be part of the group. And I guess I vetoed it anyway. But anyways, and Joan had a very, very serious role in the city. It was mentioned by the obituary and by the mayor of all the things that she was involved in. And to think about being involved that much time and how important it was and how many things that she did and how many people that she moved to follow her in all these things. Wetland and woodlands in Southfield have been always a very important part of our environment. So her starting off in that field and making sure that those things that were now being built in the city were environmentally sound, and she let everybody know that she was watching. So, the other thing I'd like to mention is, the 24 years that she was there, I sat back and I was saying, do you know how many zonings and ordinances and physical debates she was involved in, and how many yeses or nos she gave over a period of 24 years? That is really remarkable to give that kind of service to the city of Southfield and to any city that you're occupying. I wanted to also say that, she really had a big heart for people. She very cared a lot for people. It kind of never showed. She was kind of quiet, reserved, but she really, if you got to know her, she really thought a lot about people. And just to point, I don't know if Sydney made it today, but she took Sydney to the doctor, and she was a friend of his and would help him go wherever he needed to go. He was a former councilman, and they were friends. And really the neat part about it is that Sidney Lance just became his 97th birthday this last week. And when you think about that, he celebrated by going to Kroger shopping, by the way. And she was also, special when we get together and we have events, and she'd run across my wife and ask, how's the family? And when she seen me, it was also, how were the boys and girls doing? Having a big family, of course, that we had. She's always interested in what they were doing and how they're going and how they're doing in school and those kinds of things. And a lot of people didn't see that side of Joan, but she was very, very special in that manner. And I know that, I had my ups and downs with her. I had my arguments with her, but she always did her homework, believe it or not. She knew what she was talking about, and she'd give you a pretty good hustle right here and there. But she was very courageous. She spoke her mind. She made sure that she got her point across, and she voted the way she felt she should vote. And that was very important for the growing up at Southfield. The thing that I also had with her was I had a business in the area, backed up to the woods, and she'd come in the back and feed the cats and whatever animals that were there. But I'd go out there and talk to her, and she said, Don, you should feed these cats. And I said, Joan, and then she started telling me about these God's creatures and things, and I said, well, that's nice, Joan. I think somebody's calling me, Joan. But she was very, very nice, and like I said, she was really thoughtful about certain things, and people were one of those. And of course, she worked well with the residents. I know that she had a big following in this city by people who have already been concerned about Joan and what could we do something and this and that. And sometimes you don't see them come out as often as they should, but she had quite an army out there that always made her run for office, and they always supported her. The last meeting that we had, Joan was there. Not the last one, I think the one previous to this. Joan was there. She sits next to me, and she's making notes and all this. And I said, hey, Joan, I understand you're doing a write-in campaign. And she said, well, I just didn't feel good. I was getting signatures outside the library, and I just didn't get them all there. And so she's doing a write-in. I said, well, let me know if I can help you. And she said, well, I'll let you know. And, of course, whatever happened, happened, and we never got together. But anyways, that's one of the things that I just admired about Joan, and I told her that, you know, I just don't particularly like cats, but I ended up with 5 of them. You know, 3 outside that my wife has. She's sitting over, so I'll tell it. And 2 that I found somewhere, whatever, and have them fixed, and we have them inside. 1 I'm going to throw out. But anyways, on a serious note, you know, I thought of this often, and knowing Joan and the circumstances, and I said, you know how great it is that I have a very large family and a loving wife, and I said, you know, that the worst thing that I could ever happen to me would, when I'm ready to go, not to have somebody hold my hand and care about me going. And so I think that we as people here, I think we should work a little extra in knowing our neighbor, our friends, call often, check on them, check on your next door neighbor if you don't see anything happening. You know, it just takes a second, a minute or 2. But every one of us really should do that. And I know that if it was reversed, Joan would be the one that would come over and say, how are you? How are you doing? Can I do anything for you? So anyways, God bless you, Joan, and Godspeed. May God follow you wherever you are. Thank you.
we're at this point in the program where anyone who would like to come forward and share a brief reflection or memory, you're welcome to come forward. Please use the microphone where we are recording this presentation. Anyone? Barbara Talley? Oh.
I want to say to my Southfield family, this is a time that it's good for all of us to come together and to pay tribute to a public servant. In politics, awful, there is discourse and there is all of the type of conflicting policies and discussion. But at the end of the day, our democracy rests in the hand of having the diverse voices come forward. No place is it clearer than on a city council. And you know, I served on the city council with Joan. I served as the mayor of this city. And there were many times, because when the environment came forward, Joan and I were on the same page. There were times where we had different opinions. And one thing that I will tell anyone, a person who steps up and takes the oath of office to serve and protect the people, they're the gatekeepers of our democracy of this great country, and they deserve honor and recognition. And so, as here today, as I am the Congresswoman representing this great district, and I am Joan's Congresswoman, I stand here today to pay tribute to her life, to a woman who never backed down from what she believed in. Believe me, I lived through that. I know she did. Her passion about the environment. And today, on a national level, we're having debates about, are we really protecting this earth? And are we the gatekeepers of this generation to pass it to the next generation? Because we cannot survive without a healthy earth. And Joan was one that had that belief long before it was popular. And so I joined today with you in celebrating her life and her service to this great city, and to send my heartfelt condolences to the residents of Southfield, to her friends, and to all those who knew her, and to say that we often, at the end date, come together to celebrate a life, but it's the dash in the middle between the birth date and the end date that really matters and make a difference. And so today, I want us all to recommit to making that time on this earth something that is transformational, something that uses the skills and a talent that only you possessed, your journey, your life, your passion. I tell people constantly, you were not created to suck up the air. You were created, you have a mission, you have a task. Never lose focus of that. And let Joan's commitment to the environment be one to say, I too have a mission and a job to do. God bless you all.
Similar to the Congresswoman, I do have a proclamation that's memorializing Councilwoman Joan Seymour, and I'm not going to read it, but I will say it is signed by all 21 commissioners. Joan had an impact not only in the city, her reach, especially in the environmental areas, was throughout the county. She served on several county environmental boards and commissions. And one thing I can truly say is I looked at her as my civic teacher with a specialization in environment. I learned more about the environment from Joan than I have in anything I've read. And to that point, she enjoyed sharing it. To the point that even when you say, Joan, I got it, There was two more things she had to tell you about. But one of the things I truly have appreciation for Councilwoman Seymour is her compassion. It was mentioned and it was spoke about earlier. When my mother passed, Joan spent several nights with me at my mother's home, just to ensure that I was okay and that I was getting the things and doing the things that my family needed. But more importantly to her, she was concerned that I was taking care of myself. As many of you who've had the opportunity to be a caretaker know that you really expend more of yourself than you really realize. And I didn't realize that until Joan spent the time explaining, teaching me again, that as a caretaker you can. And needless to say, as you're going through this caretaking, and that was another area that Joan was very concerned about, along with environmental caretakers. After my mother made her transition, I got very sick. And while I was in the hospital, Joan spent many days with me in the hospital. I was only there for 2 weeks. But you don't see that part of her. And you don't really recognize how much compassion she has, and I'm sure wherever she is, she's sharing it now. So to that point, I would like to say I join with everyone in giving my condolence. I'm going to miss my friend Joan. I am going to remember my civics lessons, and I am certainly going to try to live up to the compassion that she showed to others. Thank you.
I go back to the 1980s when I was on city council. And I think the only person, there were two people, Donald Fracassi and is Sue? Yeah, there she is. I knew she was here. I think we're the only ones that were here at that particular time. And I remember so well when Joan Seymour called me up and said, I want you to come over and look at the woodlands. I said, the woodlands? She said, yes, they're gonna build that woodlands right across 696. And so I did, and I saw what she was talking about. She was so determined that they were not going to spoil those woodlands. And what she did was to call the state, and she persisted that things would not be the way that they said that they would be. And they changed. They did something. I don't know what they did, but they changed. Then she formed and organized this organization called the Wetlands and the Woodlands. She then called me again, and she said, I want to get that wetlands ordinance. Would you help me? I said, okay, I'll do that. And so I did help her. And she said, I want to get it passed. So how are we going to get it passed? I said, you know what? Let's do a strategy. I said, get all your friends, get them into the council, flood the council. And when you do, we can pass it. And sure enough, she flooded the council chambers. She flooded, and that wetlands ordinance passed. And so every time that I would see her, she would always have that smile on her face, and she would say, I remember Barbara and the wetlands. And she would smile, and every time she would have this big smile on her face about the wetlands. And so today I remember her, and I remember that smile, and will always remember that when I think of the wetlands and the woodlands and all of the other wood things that she talked about. And so I just say today that I'm smiling when I think about her.
I know the private Joan Seymour very well. And I will just tell you a couple things about the private Joan Seymour. I've known Joan since I was 10 years old. We met in Sunday school at the Christian Missionary Alliance Church, which was at Forest and 2nd. And Wayne University has since purchased that property. Joan had a very difficult life, much more difficult than you can ever imagine. Joan considered my family her family. Whenever she had difficulty with her vehicles, she would call on my 3 brothers, and we were blessed to be able to help her. Joan lived through the 1967 riots at 16th and the Boulevard, and she and her mother and brother were on the floor because there were bullets overhead. She loved the neighborhood, loved the people, as she has with all of you in Southfield. I've heard so much about Southfield, I feel like I have perhaps lived in Southfield. The other part of Joan that I am so familiar with is there was an organization in the 50s called Youth for Christ, and that was an organization that we belonged to. There were probably 300 young people on a Saturday evening that would gather, and Ed Darling at the time was part of that association, and which originally Billy Graham had been involved with. I'm delighted to be here. I'm so pleased to have listened to each of you and your friendship with Joan. As you have said, she was an extremely compassionate person. Each year when I would, from retirement, each year when I would be leaving for Florida, Joan would call me. She would always anticipate when I was leaving, and she would say, Mary, you're my sister. I'm not keen. The planes, you know, there have been problems lately. I'm not keen on you going to Florida. And fortunately, Joan was able to spend some time in Florida with me on occasion, but Southfield came first. So more often than not, she was committed here. I know Joan knew Jesus Christ as her personal Savior. I have no question but what I will see Joan in heaven someday.
Ms. Seymour introduced herself to me, and she and I went to lunch, and she told me quite a bit about her family members that happen to have been in the military, in their military life. And each time I ran into Ms. Seymour, she would always inquire, how are the veterans doing? How's the Veterans Commission doing? She was dedicated to making sure that our veterans were treated well here in Southfield, and the Veterans Commission was treated well here in Southfield. And to indicate her kindness and compassion, and also perhaps concern, when she realized I was going to run for election this most recent time, she offered to help me with my literature, to design it and do whatever she could to make sure it was successful. And once I was elected, she extended quite a few courtesies to me, and this will echo pretty much what has been said now. Joan was a very compassionate person. She had a lot of kindness in her heart, and I think I'm glad to have known her.
Don, you hit it right on the head, and as well as Nancy. She was such a compassionate person. She attended my daughter's wedding and was so happy, and then just a couple years later, she was there to comfort me on the loss of my son. And just July the 26th, she came to our church, and she said, Sylvia, I've got to get these petitions in. I said, Joan, you know I'm here for you. So we got some petitions circulated, And I was there when they said she didn't have enough to get on. I said, Joan, it's gonna be okay. You still have so much to live for. But you know what? She decided to go and live with God because she knew God. Because in our council meetings, prior to the meetings, we'd have some good discussions about the Youth for Christ group that she was in and how she loved God and how she was committed to Him. She didn't tell everybody. It was just her and I conversation. But she loved people. And sometimes people would talk about her, but you know, she had such a strong spirit, and she loved God, and she loved the city of Southfield. So Joan, will see you in heaven, and you served well the city of Southfield.
I'm president of the Dr. Martin Luther King Task Force. Joan and I would often communicate. I hadn't planned to say anything today, but I need to say something. There's no question, she loved this city. You know, people have talked about her passion for the environment, but she also had a passion for this city. And many times she would tell me she chose to stay here. As the demographics of our city changed, Joan was extremely proud of that we were able to maintain the diversity of the city. And she exemplified the passion of our Southfield being the center of it all. And she would constantly tell me, I'm never leaving here. I've had some of my friends have encouraged me to move to other places in Oakland County, but she says, this is where I need to be. And I agreed. She was a adamant supporter of the task force. I don't think in our entire 30 years, Joan had maybe missed one program, if that. She always sat in the front, and she was very proud of her support of the task force and our King celebration here. She thought it was one of the finest things that the city does for the community. And as I look across this room, I got all choked up to see that. I want to thank you on her behalf, because this audience also reflects her passion and commitment to the diversity of our area. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I just wanted to share those words. Thank you.
Our history goes back over 20 years. We didn't know each other at the time, but as Ms. Talley mentioned, she was a fighter for the environment with the woodlands and the wetlands, which was in my neighborhood as I was growing up. But because of her efforts to save that area, the city was able to get a very nice park out of it. Some of it's developed, some of it's not. And the parts that's not developed, my friends and I, and now I take my children there, we walk through the different nature paths and the different trails, and you were able to look at the beauty that's kind of a hidden gem in Southfield. And when I joined the council, we would have conversations about that same wetland area. We had different views on what we should do with it. Always keep it wetlands, but I wanted it more promoted. She just wanted to leave it be, let the environment fend for itself, if you will. But we shared that common passion, and I'm thankful to her for her dedication to the city and for her dedication to the environment, that I was able, and still am able, to reap the rewards for her efforts. May she rest in peace.
I am a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I represent the South Berg Association. I guess I am kind of the transition from before she was a council person to when she was a council person. And how I got to know her was, in our neighborhood, there's a piece of property that was owned by the city, and there was a commercial firm that came in and wanted to develop it, and it was a woodland. And we didn't have an association. I myself, I'm an environmentalist, MSU, master's degree. I'm in the, I retired from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the planning department. And so we were up in arms. What can we do? And in the meantime, Joan had, as many of the other speakers have said, has gone through this 696, and she had fought the good battle. She heard about us and came over, and we formed a committee, and lo and behold, eventually that became Horsetail Woods. She, with us, formed the South Berg Association, a homeowners association, and it's something that no one has mentioned. She was a staunch supporter of people, and particularly associations and homeowners. As she got more and more involved in politics and the things that were going on, she lived with her mother, her beloved mother, and her mother died. And I think that she was a little bit lost for a bit there, and then she got her calling, and she asked me, "Les, I want to run for city council. Will you help me?" Sure. And so we formed a committee, and she was elected. It wasn't long after that when she said, "Les, you're an environmentalist. There's an opening on the Zoning Board of Appeals. Would you consider it?" And I said, my father was mayor of a little town out in South Dakota. That's about all I know about city government, but sure. And I've been on the board for over 20 years now. And so Joan's fingers kind of runs through the city and through us. And she was my friend, and I consider her a colleague. And I guess my parting words would be a life well lived.
I first met her at a public hearing for the freeway park and for the freeway. By then, the freeway was kind of under construction, and they had their big trucks and their contracts were let, and it's the Michigan Department of Transportation. I don't know if you've ever worked with them before, but they like to keep going. So she got up at that meeting, and she stopped the construction of 696 all by herself, I would say. So that was always very impressive. For a few months, I was the only person with Bill Wollensack that she knew at the city, so I would spend a long time on the phone, and my ear would be a little bit red after that when I was done. Later on, so the way that works is they kept building their highway, and the land that was taken for the highway had to be replaced, and that's how we kind of worked towards Lincoln Woods. And then we wanted to add to Lincoln Woods, and so I wrote all the applications, and the application went in, but it wasn't scoring very well. We didn't really have a site plan for a big public access, and I got a call from my grant coordinator, which is the position I have now at the state, and he asked me, he's like, "Do you know Joan Seymour?" And I was like, and so the project got funded, and I always knew in all of our dealings with land acquisitions, which we've been very active for an urban community. I mean, still now when I can see all the projects of the whole state, I don't think too many communities hold a candle to Southfield and natural resources preservation. And I always knew Joan and many other council people would be there for us when we had the applications that go in. But once we got the land, then Joan didn't really want you to go on the land. She didn't want really any people to go on the land, and it would take a lot of negotiations just to talk about a little trail and a little boardwalk over here. And so Carpenter Lake being the last major project that we acquired and developed. And I got her, you know, there's a big day. Joan's going to come out and walk the site with me. And I was pretty nervous because she doesn't like trails and she doesn't like walks to be very wide. And there's a nice big wide walk through the woods. And afterward she goes, "It's really nice. I really like the trail." So that was like the best thing. Joan was compassionate too, persistent and compassionate. She always, if anybody knows me, she would come in and offer me advice on my office and how I could clean it up. And I said, "Thank you, Joan." But when my mom passed, and we had a little stone church out in the sticks where I've always lived, and I still live. It's the morning of your mother's funeral, and there's Joan in the pews, so I remember that. And I have 3 cats.
Myron Frazier, Council President, has some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm here to do double duty. My own thoughts, and Uni Rose could not be here today, but she's a friend of Joan's, and she asked me if she wrote something, would I read it? And I said, certainly. I'm going to share my thoughts first. You know, as I sit here listening to people talk, I hear 2 major themes about Joan. One is her passionate support of the city of Southfield and her passionate support of the environment. And one of the greatest tributes that we could give to Joan and the memory of Joan is to not let that go away. We have to pick up the mantle and move forward and make sure that the woodlands, the wetlands, and even the birds are protected. And it hit me very clearly on the way over here. I was listening to the radio in my car, and they were interviewing a fellow that owned property where the hurricanes came through. And he wasn't living in the floodplains, but he's been flooded 3 times. And they were talking about the federal flood insurance. And he had flood insurance, but some of his neighbors did not. And the reason that he was flooded, the conclusion is the developers paved over all the wetlands. They paved over the natural things that absorb the water that comes down from rainstorms and hurricanes and everything, and turns places that are not floodplains into floodplains. So I say that we as council members and future council members need to pick up the mantle and serve Joan's concerns about the city of Southfield and the wetlands and woodlands, because they're tied together. One of the other things that went through my mind is Joan and I served together for a long time on council, and we didn't always see things the same way. We may have wanted the same end result, but we didn't see how to get there the same way. But the one thing in our discussions was Joan was always courteous. There are times when 2 people don't see things the same way, they lose their temper, and Joan never lost her temper. She always explained her position, and most of the time she won. So those are my thoughts. Now I'll read the thoughts of Uni Rose. I'm so sorry that I cannot be here today as we remember Councilwoman Joan Seymour. I have known her since she first came on the scene as an environmentalist. Oh, how she loved nature. I knew Joan from the city doings as well as young audiences of Michigan and our Southfield Philharmonic. I recall her helping to set up my living room for a little fundraiser concert. She was so busy, she also helped me arrange my husband's collection of mugs and steins, as well as my collection of family photos. One does not forget these kindnesses. I hope that you will all have good memories of Joan. She was a public servant for many years, and even when she seemed to be less than perfect these last few months, it is important that we remember the good things that she accomplished. Southfield meant the world to her, and she meant the world to me. Uni Rose.
At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to have a moment of silence, and then we'll conclude our program. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. We do have some refreshments in the rear if you'd like to stay.